So for this Inktense project, this is going to be what I would consider a more entry level, like beginner type project. It's not a difficult project. And you may be looking at this going, what are you talking about? That's a lot of detail. The detail is time consuming. It's not difficult. And I'm going to show you how to do that. But the cool thing about this and why I still consider it a more beginner type thing is that I'm not refining a ton of tiny detail like my blending and such. I'm keeping very, very simple. And the cool thing about this is that because there is so much busyness going on, it is a lot easier to make it look good. And this is something that you guys hear me talk about all the time. The more detailed, the busier something is, it is a lot easier to make look good than something that is more simple. So I think this is going to be a great project if you are new to Inktense. Plus, even if you're not new, I may have some tips for you in this too. First, I want to show you an easy way if you choose to trace your work. This is an easy way to do it. I'm just going to tape my work to my computer monitor. I bump my brightness on the monitor up all the way, and I turn the lights off on the room. Well, most of the lights off in the room, so I can really see the detail. When I draw this out in Inktense, I am using a water-soluble graphite pencil. I'm using the Faber-Castell graphite aquarelle, so that when I'm blending out with the Inktense, graphite lines aren't going to show through. The Inktense pencils will come with, I don't know if they still do, I know they used to come with a pencil that would not blend out. That's the opposite of what I personally want. I don't want to see the graphite lines there, so I've drawn this out with a 2B graphite aquarelle, so again, water-soluble graphite pencil. And I'm just using the same masking tape I use to tape my artwork to the board, I'm using to tape to the computer monitor. I have never had it damage a monitor. Now, if you have a touch screen, obviously this method is not going to work for you. But for me, I've done this for years when I want to save time and I don't want to freehand, or even if I freehanded it, let's say I drew it on my Wacom tablet, I can then trace it off the monitor like this so that I've got clean lines on my artwork and I don't have a lot of erasing on the work that I'm going to be doing the art itself. Notice that I only taped it to the top of the monitor, not all four corners, because I want to be able to lift this to see if I've got all of my lines. Sometimes when you're working, it can be a little bit hard to tell if you've got everything covered. So this is what your work should look like before we start. We've got all of that detail in there, and you can see I've even shaded in where the black is going to go with the graphite because it's going to be completely covered. I wouldn't want to do that if that was going to be, let's say, orange, because that would smudge into the orange and muddy it up. But because I'm going to be putting black right on top of this, we're going to keep this one really simple, I can go ahead and shade that in to make my life a little bit easier. So on to step two, what our goal is for this next, once the video starts, is getting everything dark, just lined with black. And I'm using the black Inktense blocks. Now you might think, why would you use the Inktense blocks? Why wouldn't you just use the Inktense pencils for the base layer? What I use the Inktense blocks for, how I use them is more like a watercolor pan. So I dip the paintbrush in water and then I mix it onto the block itself. And I just keep it in the package it's originally in. And now I can fill this in. If I were to use the pencil, one, it would take longer because I'd have to shade all this in again with pencil, unless I had drawn it out in the first place with pencil. But even then, when I have to go over to blend it out with the water, that's an extra step. It takes longer. It's way faster to use the blocks in this case, like a watercolor pan. Now, if you don't have the blocks, you only have the pencils, you can just scribble the pencil onto a scratch piece of paper, a piece of sandpaper, and lift it up. Use that, use the paintbrush, add water to the paintbrush, and then lift it off the paper. So you're kind of creating your own little mixture. But the reason that I don't like to put the pencil directly onto the paper for the base layers, and when you go to blend it out, it doesn't ever blend all the way. So when you do another layer, let's say you glaze on top, the previous layer smudges out. You just end up with a bit of a muddy mess with the pencils because, again, you're not dissolving that completely. Now, there is a time where I like the pencils, and you'll see this on this. We have half the pieces done and with pencil on top. But I always like to get my base layers first with just painting it on. And now the reason that I'm doing black first, Inktense is really the only medium that I do this in. I like to line everything with black wherever I know I have the really dark areas, because this is going to stay put when I glaze, or I'm doing what's essentially a glaze. When I layer paint on top, those other colors are very translucent. So I don't lose any of my lines. It's a way that I can get this done very, very quickly. So when you're looking at this going, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much work. No, we're simplifying that. We're going to make this really easy. Now, if you wanted to make this more advanced, you certainly could be putting more time into all of these details. You can see I'm being fairly loose pretty much for this whole piece. I would consider this more loose than what you sometimes will see me working with, but that's up to you how clean or well-defined you want each line, each detail. I'm going for close here and a little bit more on the loose side. The brush I'm using is a number 4. This is the synthetic hog hair. I get those ones from Hobby Lobby. As much as I hate generic art supplies, I actually like the generic brushes. Just work great for me. So that is what I'm using there. Like a Taklon bristle filbert would work. This one is a little bit more firm, so it would be closer. I would compare this to the Simply Simmons, have a bit more firmness to them, so that would be another option to have something very similar to what I'm using here. See, I'm turning the brush to the side to get thin lines, or the other way where I want a thicker line. Remember, whenever you're painting, the harder you push with the brush, the thicker that line is going to be. You're going to have to play around with how much water versus how much of the Inktense that you want on the brush. There's no like magic formula. If you use too much water, it's going to, well, it'll be too thin, it'll run, but it also will be more translucent. If you want it to be thicker, much more opaque paint, that is going to be less water. Now, as I get to the edges where I want it to look like the feathers are frayed, I'm using even less pressure on that brush, and it gives me that feathery, sketchy, the frayed tips of the feathers there. You could also, and we're going to be using this at the end of the video, or I'm going to be using it, you don't have to, I'm going to be using a rake brush to get some of that too. Actually, I think the rake brush would have made my life a little bit easier at this step, but to be quite honest, I just couldn't find it. So I took the time and found it because I really needed it, or wanted it, I should say, at the end. But a rake brush would certainly be a good choice here. And a rake brush, if you're unfamiliar with those, if you put your hand in front of you with your fingers close together, like you're telling somebody to stop, that is your normal filbert. Now spread your fingers out, there's your rake brush. So you've got one brush stroke, you get several brush strokes out of one. Lots of little lines. Now we're just going to go through and fill in black everywhere here. So I'm going to go ahead and speed this portion of the video up. I want to make sure that my brush strokes are going in the right direction for the feathers. I don't care if they're exact. I don't even care if I've got my feathers in there exact. Close is close enough. So if I decide I think a few more dark specks would look good, throw those in there. Not a big deal. Now remember, if you were working in Inktense, this is different than watercolor in that this will not lift back up. Where a watercolor, if you go too dark, you can add water and lift a lot of that color. That is not the case here. But we've got the white Inktense block. So let's say I went too dark and I thought, oh my gosh, I wish I had not drawn the beak that way. I need to cover that. I would make a mixture like I'm using here. So I use it like a watercolor pan with the white Inktense block, and then I would paint that over the area that I want to cover, let it dry, and then I can put other paint on top. It may take a couple of coats of the white to get it opaque enough, depending on what went wrong, but there is a fix even with Inktense if you need to remove or lighten something. Now let's say you want gray and you don't want something to be black. How do you get that? Don't mix white with it unless you're trying to make something very foggy, very opaque. Your better bet, if you want something to be a lighter color, let the white of the paper work with you. So in this case, if I wanted gray, I would just thin that black paint or the black Inktense down more with water. More water, let the white of the paper be what lightens it. So when you go through your colors with the Inktense, you're going to have like these bold violets or dark purples. And if you wanted it to be a light purple, if you mix white with it, you're just getting pastel. If you want it to just be a lighter purple, mix more water so that it's more translucent. You just need to make sure the white of the paper is still white underneath. If it's not, let's say you've got something yellow and you put purple over it, you're going to get a brownish tone. So that in that case, I would just paint those areas white first. Let's say I had yellow and I wanted it purple instead. I changed my mind, paint it white, let it dry, then I can put the purple on top. But the point there is when you want a lighter version of the color, let the white of the paper be what lightens it, not just mixing white with it. And I love the Inktense white. I have bought a big box of those because I use it a lot. But you still want to be aware of when to use it and when it's not going to be so helpful. Now there's a chunk of feather going off to the side of his face there on the right. I left it out. You can see I left the graphite lines there. When I blend the background, it's going to blend out completely because I did use the water-soluble graphite. Had I used a regular graphite pencil, I would need to erase that. But that was a feather. I suspect the wind was blowing weird, or, blowing his feather forward, and it just looked a little weird to me, so I'm just going to leave that out. So there is step 2, just filling in all of the black. Now we've let that dry. Now we're going to move on to the background. Now for this background, we're going to do this in a couple of layers, or 3 layers, in order to get the color saturation where we want. Our first layer is going to be very light, so that is what we're doing now. Now the reason that we did the black first, when I go to blend that background, if I blend some of that blue or green into the subject, I don't lose those lines. My lines are still there. I can still clearly see them, and it kind of works to my benefit because, as you know, we usually want to pull some of our background colors into the subject to make them feel like they work seamlessly together. So that is why we're doing it this way. Now you could potentially use masking fluid, mask him off, and then be very messy with the background. The masking fluid is just a pain to work with. It's its own monster. Where it's sometimes very useful, in this case, I think it would have made our life harder. It's easier just to paint around it like we're going to do here. Now with the Inktense blocks, the block, well, it's the same with the pencils. They don't always look like they look in block form when you add water. So what I do is just have a scratch piece of paper next to me, and I'm just testing a few different colors to pick which blues and greens that I want to use for this. So once I pick the colors I like, I just pull them separate so I can keep track of what it is. But my goal here, I know I'm going to be using some black. I'm going to be using a blue and a green. Those are my main, that's like my goal for this one. So I'm just going to test a bunch of these until I figure out which one's which. Now, I can't tell you exactly which green or which blue I chose. The blocks are not marked in a very easy to find way. So just whatever green and blue you like is fine. So once you find the color that you want, I'm just going to use a large, this is actually one of my acrylic brushes. It's pretty damaged, but it'll work for the background here. And it's a Tack on Bristle filbert. And I'm going to go through and just fill that in. Now I am taking a spray, this is a fine mist sprayer, to lightly mist the paper to keep it wet where I want it to. Now I'm trying to keep the water off the owl as much as possible. This helps me to not have the color bleed into the owl. But to keep the paper wet, this is very different than watercolor. With watercolor, I've got these harsh brush strokes. I just add a little bit more water, even if it's dry, and it'll reactivate and I can blend it out. With Inktense, once that dries, those brush strokes are there to stay. You're not relifting, you're not reactivating it. So that's why I'm using this fine mist sprayer, and I keep lightly misting it to make sure that those areas stay wet. They dry, you're not blending it out. You can layer over it to try to help that, but it's a bit of a challenge. So ideally, just keep the area you're working on wet. Also, ideally, keep the subject dry as much as you can. I don't want to soak this. If the owl gets super soaked, when the brush stroke here, as I add a lot of water, that could just bleed right into him. And again, not the end of the world if it does, but it's easier for me. My whole thing with Inktense, the reason I like it is it's very fast. I want to use fast projects with it. So by keeping things as simple as possible, that is my goal here. So now I've taken a green, and you saw how I took the brush and I rubbed the wet paintbrush, so just water, on the block right there, and then went straight onto my paper. Again, the more water, the more translucent. If you need it to be really opaque, use less water. Now, I don't have to use a fine mist sprayer to keep these areas wet. I could just be wetting the brush and going over these areas, but my goal is do not let it dry. It is much easier to work flat. I'm working upright at an easel just because my back and my neck, that is easiest for me. But if you can work flat for painting the background like this, it would be easier because I'm having to watch and worry about the paint running down the paper. If you're working flat, that's not a concern for you. Now, in order to get your Inktense layers really dark, it takes multiple layers. I don't find that doing it as like a one-shot works real well. I mean, I guess you could, but it's just easier. Again, going back to, I want to make it as easy as possible. It's easier to let it dry and then put more layers on top until you get the saturation where you want. Now with this paper, a quick tip, I have used my tape. We're going to switch and add some blues. I've added, now you can see where it's really running. I've added, or taped my board, or my paper. Gosh, words are really hard today. I've used an Arches hot press watercolor paper, and this one came out of the block. I could have painted in the block, but I find they work so bad in that block. I am getting my paper to dry and shape much better if I just tape it to my drawing board in the first place. Removed it from the block. I know that defeats the purpose, but I removed it from the block and I taped it down. And then I took my fingernail and really went across the edges of the tape to make sure it was really sealed as much as possible. And it held really well. It worked out much better for me than when I've been trying to work inside those blocks. You pay extra for the block and then they still warp pretty bad. So this method, once I take the hairdryer to it, the paper that's warping, it dried completely flat. I think I'm done messing with the watercolor blocks myself for trying to keep, if I need something to stay flat anyway. So now I'm taking some black right along the bottom. Now this is all still wet. If it starts to dry, I want to lightly, and I can't stress the lightly part enough, lightly mist it with the fine mist sprayer. So I'm going along that edge where I want to really darken, create that it's sort of a page blocker. It helps keep the viewer into the lighter area. So I'm lightly misting that. Don't go too much, or if it starts to run, you know you misted it too much. Now I'm taking a mop brush, or actually this one's a blush brush, and I am lightly going over this to soften this out. Look at what a nice soft finish I can get with this. It has to stay wet though. See how I keep misting it? That starts to dry and it's not going to blend. Seriously, work on this part flat. So much easier. Because you can see as this is running on certain areas where if I was flat, that wouldn't even be an issue. So my goal when I use those brushes, the blush brush, say that 10 times fast, to blend is not to mix the color. So when I use the term blending often, but I think that may not be the right term. I'm softening my edges. I just want to get rid of my brush strokes. I am not trying to completely mix the blues into the greens. If you overdo with that mop brush, if you keep working and blending, you'll lose the green and the blue and the black. You'll just have one medium color. We don't want to overblend it. Just enough brush strokes that we lose the brush strokes. That doesn't make sense, does it? Enough brush strokes with the blender that we get rid of or soften down those brush strokes. Now, if you want your brush strokes in that background to show, that's okay. It's not a right or wrong thing. It's just your personal preference. For me, I was going for something very soft. So you can see as I take the hairdryer to this, I have this on high heat, this is starting to dry the paper. You can see it's wiggling less and less as it dries back into shape, and it dried completely flat. When I've used this same exact pad of paper and I tried to do the same thing but left it in the block because it's basically glued along the edges, it just wasn't enough. It didn't dry back flat. So this is what we should look like at this stage. Now you can certainly leave it here if you like where this is at. This is a bit lighter. So I'm going to do more layers like this to darken it up even more. I wanted my colors to be more vibrant. So this is my next goal. Very similar. It's not a huge change, but the colors are much more opaque now because of the way that I'm layering them on top. The other cool thing about this is that these colors are still going to be semi-translucent. So you get this really nice depth in that. You can see layers underneath where there are some that blotchy look, and then another color on top. It's almost softens it and gives you depth at the same time, on top of getting your colors to be more rich. So same thing, I'm just going to go ahead and start layering in these dark colors. Now this is actually that dark greenish blue. It looks black. It's not straight black there. I will be adding black, but I'm not jumping straight to that yet. It's almost more of an indigo color. Now, if you were doing this in watercolor, your layering process would need to be very different. See here how I can keep working the brush over the same area again and again. It doesn't reactivate or lift the previous layer. When you layer with watercolor, you've got to be more careful because if you keep doing multiple brush strokes, it does start to lift off your previous layer, so you make things lighter. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's annoying. It's not this is better or worse as far as which medium. It's just a difference you need to be aware of. get some black in there. I'm just rinsing that in water, and I am using distilled water just so that I am less likely to have the colors fade. So Inktense, this is there's questions on how light fast it is. I've never seen any of mine fade to date, but I've only been working on it for what, maybe 7 years, 5 years, I don't know how long, but probably about 7 years. None of those have faded, but 7 years isn't a good indication. I also put the ones that were on display behind UV protecting glass, so that's also going to help. But some of the colors, we don't know. Derwent didn't test them they can't tell you if they are going to hold the same light fastness once water is added. In theory, it should. We should be fine with that, but there are questions there. Some of the colors are very light fast or rated as being as light fast as they can be, some not at all. So for me, just because there's some questions, I don't sell these. I only make prints. They photograph so well, so easily, and it's a very fast medium. So good for prints. Let's say I was going to write a book or do some sort of illustration like that. I'd probably go with Inktense because it is so fast and the colors are very vibrant. But I'm not going to sell the originals because not all, we've got some light fast concerns there. But to make it easier for yourself, don't use tap water to blend. If the more we use the different chemicals in our water when it comes to water, like any watercolor pencils, Inktense, water soluble graphite, any of that, I'm not comfortable using the tap water because there are so many chemicals in our water. We don't know what will cause yellowing over time. It may not. Let's just not risk it. I just use distilled water for my water mediums. Now with the Inktense, it dries very, very matte, which means it's going to look kind of dry, like foggy looking. So that is something to keep in mind too. As I dry this, watch how much lighter it's going to be. So if I want it even darker, I would do more layers, and you can keep layering as much as you want until you get that darkness, that richness where you want it to be. So as I dry this, you can see how it gets much lighter. Now the lighting it's under will make a huge difference too. As I work through this, you'll see the step-by-step photos. I'm under my easel, which is it overexposes everything, but it really does so with the Inktense. When you frame Inktense and you have it under natural lighting, it's going to look much darker. It looks much better. It is so pale and well, foggy looking is, I guess, an easy way to describe that, as you're under your really bright lights. So just be aware it will look much nicer when you get it out from under those. Now I haven't played around with it. You could potentially use a gloss varnish over it too. I'll have to test some and let you guys know how that goes. Maybe I'll test it on this one later on, but that may be a way to get your colors darker too. I'm not certain on that just yet. Okay, so that is where we should look right now, where now that color saturation is much more bold. Now this doesn't look like there's a huge change, but what we're going to do, I'm going to darken the corners a little bit, and then I'm going to pull more of the greens. I definitely wanted more of that blotchy green look going in the background. So I'm taking this light green pencil and I am just going to go right over this background. Now, this is the cool thing. I am going to blend it a little bit, but when you're using the pencils, I really like them over areas where I've already done a base layer. They don't come out so blotchy looking. If I were to take my pencils and try to shade in the background and then add water to blend it, they come out looking more grainy, gritty. Sometimes that's a really cool look, but it's not what I wanted on this background. But going over what's already painted with the blocks now, look how smooth that looks. And I'm going to blend it out so that I can soften it even more with adding some water on top of that. Now, one of the things that is sometimes annoying when working with the Inktense pencils, they are always going to make things darker. There aren't many colors that are very light. Like you could use a light green colored pencil and it's going to show up really well. Not so much with the Inktense pencils. So keep in mind, things are going to get darker. Always start light and then work to your darker colors because it is very hard to lighten stuff. Unless, of course, we go through, like we were talking earlier, where we paint the white. We'll be doing that at the end, so don't worry, you'll get to see that. But where we can paint it white and then put color on top is an option. But as far as like with colored pencil, we would just take a more pastel color and lighten something up. Inktense just gets darker. Like even the lighter violets and stuff, they just make everything darker. So keep that in mind as you're working with these. Now I'm using the ink black pencil around the edges where I want it to be a bit darker. I'm not pushing very hard here. The harder you push with these pencils, the less it's going to blend out. Like it sticks in its original form way too much if you push very hard. And it's not even like with colored pencil where I'm normally worried about damaging the tooth of the paper. I don't really worry about that here because I can paint colors on top, no big deal. It's just an issue of it doesn't blend out well if you've pushed hard. I'm using that same brush and I'm going to lightly go over that. I actually didn't like this brush for that, so I ended up switching to a sort of scrubber brush or it's your synthetic hog hair, like the cheapy ones you get in those sets, like Michael's or wherever. It usually will have a canvas holder and it'll have a bunch of round brushes and a bunch of flat brushes. They're super cheap, but that is what I'm using to blend it out. I ended up liking this better, that one right there. A little too much water. I need to dry that off on a paper towel. I don't want too much water here. And I'm just going to smudge that out to soften it out. And I'm going to dry that. Remember, if you get a layer and you're like, oh, I liked it so much better when it was wet and it was dark, put more layers until it comes out that dark. Now I need to blend out the black as well. Now, one of the biggest mistakes people often make if they're new to using paintbrushes for any type of painting medium is they make too many brush strokes. Less is more. You usually don't need, what I often see people do, they'll make 10 brush strokes and it's perfect, looks good, and they think, well, if 10 look good, 50 must look better. No, do less and then slowly do a little bit more blending as needed. You're going to have to get the hang of how much water you want on that brush as you're blending out. There's no magic formula I can give you. It's just going to take practice. And you're just going to layer until it looks good. You may have some layers and you're like, wow, that looked terrible. Go over it. Keep adding more layers. Heck, if it looked absolutely terrible, paint one solid color over everything. It would actually soften everything out quite a bit too. You would still see some of the previous brush strokes and blotches, but it would be more muted. So you've got a lot of options. You want to figure out how to make it work. Don't give up on your piece. If something is going wrong, you're like, well, I really didn't like that background. Don't stop. Even if the background doesn't end up with the way that you intended it to, figure out how to make it work so you can at least finish the piece. You're going to learn so much more from doing that than you would from starting over continuously. Now, anywhere where I'm adding water too over the background that's already there, it's going to look a lot darker just because of the water. When it dries, it'll lighten right back up. So you can see how that's super, super blotchy. When it dries, it won't be. Now, if you get kind of confused and you're like, well, how do I know when it's going to be blotchy? How do I know when it's blended enough? You paint more. It really is as simple as that. There's no like formula I can give you that would tell you. You just have to paint and experience it more so you know what to expect. And that just comes, sometimes it comes from painting really terrible things. That's part of the learning process. Don't let it discourage you. Okay, so there is what it should look like now before we move on. Our next layer is going to be terrifyingly ugly. It doesn't look good. It's okay. It's not supposed to. We've just got to get these base layers in. So I'm going to start with the eye. Now look at, this is what's so cool about having done the black first. It's not going to reactivate as I put the oranges over it. It doesn't smudge into it and make a muddy mess. If I were doing this with watercolor, I would not put these black lines first because they would have, as I get colors over them or next to them, it reactivates. And so that black would mush into it into a muddy, muddy mess. With Inktense, I don't really have to worry about that. The black's not moving. If it does, it's minor as long as I've really dissolved that that pigment into an ink. Now, I have heard where people will say it did seem to blend out a little bit. If it does, it's so minor. It's really not a big deal. It's not like what you would experience with watercolor, that's for sure. So I put a lighter yellow at the bottom and then the orange on top. It's really foggy muted. We're going to need more layers to get that to be as vivid as that end result is. So now I've taken it's just a tannish brown color. I just tested some of the Inktense blocks that I had on a piece of paper till I found a color that should be close enough. I'm going to wipe that over everything. And I do want to get some variation in there. The color of brown you don't use isn't a huge deal. Use, if you want it to be lighter, obviously mix more water. So if you've chosen one that's really dark, but I do want to get some variation where I've got more oranges, more reddish browns, and the more golden brown. So just choose a couple of different colors to mix in through this. See, that was really dark. It's the same brown, but because it doesn't have much water on it, it came out more brown versus the golden tones I'm getting where I've mixed more water. Now, some of this is going to start muddying up because I've got a lot of the graphite, the water-soluble graphite pencil that I used is going to mix in with this color because I had a lot of that on there. For me, that's fine because it is a grayish brown tone for the bird. I'm not worried about it. I would not want this much graphite or water-soluble graphite mixed in like this. Let's say I was drawing a bright yellow fish. I wouldn't want to do a bunch of shading with the graphite and then wipe or brush the yellow over it because it would mix together and get very, very muddy. Here, muddy's fine. Muddy, like this grayish tone is fine for the bird, so I'm not worried about it. So just my point is don't feel like when you're doing your initial sketch, if you're working on a subject that is brighter yellows and oranges, that you're going to want to shade in that much with a water-soluble graphite pencil because that would mix in with it if you wiped over it like I'm doing here. If it was a darker color like purples, blues, in this case browns, no problem. I'm not really worried about it. It's mostly the yellows and oranges we want to watch. But we don't have a lot of that in this piece, so we are good. You see, I'm not super worried about my brushstroke, which direction it goes in. I've pretty much already gotten the feel of that by my base layers with the black. You can really see there, I hit a spot that had a lot of water-soluble graphite in it, really grayed up. And it's not that that's a bad thing, it's just something you want to be aware of if you put as much graphite as I did on this. Now we've got our reference photo. I am clearly not copying that reference photo exactly. We're using it fairly, a loose representation of that photo. I am not worried about everything being exact here. Now, even this area around the eye, that is going to have a lot of white in it, and especially if you look at your reference photo, initially you look at it and go, okay, it's white. We need to get the darks in first so that we can put the white detailing on top. Now, I'm going to end up going too light and having to come back through at some point towards the end, darken it up again and redo it. So you'll be able to really see how you can fix if something gets too dark, you can always lighten it. But we need to get a dark base first so that the light colors on top have something to work with. Now I'm using a more reddish brown, so I start getting some of that variation. Plus I want more color saturation too, so it's not quite so dull brown. You know, if you're thinking, I don't know which brown to use, you can honestly do this with just one. Two is ideal. You know, I've got a golden brown and a reddish brown, but you can do it with just one if you needed to, because it's really more about your values. Light's light enough, dark's dark enough. That's what's going to make a difference in your work, not having the perfect color. So don't stress yourself out too much. The big thing, it's not yellow. Do not use yellow on this guy. That's my one, like, huge do not do type thing as far as color goes. Any of your tans, your golden browns, those are fine, but straight out yellow, it's gonna look weird. You can see it's getting really foggy where I've gone over some of those black feathers. That's fine. We're going to go back over those with the pencil anyway. That was just our base layer. So it doesn't matter that they're getting foggy now with all of the paint on or ink on top of it. So I'm putting a little bit of blue, same blue I used in the background. Now this is getting to a super ugly stage. Don't let it scare you. So that is what we should look like right now at step 6. That is terrifying. We're going to fix it. But it's supposed to be. And I think that's important for you to see how bad and really be aware of how bad some of these stages go, because you'll hit this in your work and go, oh, I've ruined it. I can't pull this off. Throw it away, start over. No, this is a part of the process. And as you can see from our next step, this is when we start pulling everything together. So I'm starting with the ink black, and I am burnishing. A lot of what I do with the pencils, I'm pushing a lot harder than you would typically see me use with regular pencils, or if I was going to blend this out. Most of these pencils I don't intend to blend out with a lot of water. If you do, it just kind of takes over. It's like you're leaving so much pigment on the paper. When you blend it with water, it really takes over. So the majority of what I do when I use the Inktense pencils, very minimal blending. Most of it is going to be done just with the pencil itself. And I'm pretty much going to take this black and burnish it. So pushing fairly hard, going over anywhere where the black already is, and then a few extra details on top of that. I'm doing the same thing with the white, pulling some of those wispy feathers in. Now, this is where you can really see when you're trying to put the white on there. If you did not go dark enough with those base layers, the white is hardly going to show up. Like it doesn't, there's not enough contrast between that and the color underneath. So if you went too light, you're going to have to do, and I did that here quite a bit, you'll come back through with your darker colors in between. And most of what I'm going to be doing throughout this at this stage is just the black and the white pencil. A little bit with some browns, but mostly the black and the white is what you're going to focus on here. You can really see that I'm adding a lot of pressure. Look how nice and dark that gets. I love the ink, like if I was only going to choose between the Inktense blocks and the Inktense pencils, I do think that the Inktense blocks are far more versatile, so that's normally my recommendation. But I would still get at least the black pencil because I can get this far darker than what I can get with the Inktense block black. But I love them in combination where I layer the one over the other. Now, as I do these pencil strokes, I want to make sure that they're going in about the right direction for the feathers. I'm not just putting random confetti lines all over the place. I am looking at that photo. That doesn't mean that they need to be exact. I just need to be close. Now notice as these feathers on the side of the face, some are going up, some are going down. It's not random. Look at your photo. And I stress that because it's very easy to just start cross-hatching and putting lines everywhere. That's not what we're doing there. Look at your photo. Which direction do those feathers move in? You know, I am keeping this fairly loose, but we still want them going in the right direction. Loose doesn't mean just be super sloppy. So I'm pushing really hard around the eyes, getting that really clean line. Notice we've still got that highlight on the underside of that lid right there, the rim. And I'm taking some, like that really bold reddish orange, pushing pretty hard, going over the top portion of the eye so I get that nice bright color. A little bit more with the shadow here with the black, right under that upper lid. Make sure that white line that in this case, I'm going to actually go over it with, I'll paint some more on there and make it look better. But the point is, if you do your highlight like that, just make it at least slightly curved. It's not a straight line. At first glance, it looks that way, but it's not. It is slightly curved. Kind of white highlight just on the underside of that eye there. Now you don't have to keep these pencils super, super sharp. It just depends on what you're doing, how much tiny detail you're going for. You can see that's fairly dull at this point. So this whole section of the face is quite a bit darker. I'm just using the black there. Watch how these lines start switching direction. Keep looking at that reference photo. Doesn't need to be exact, but we do want this moving in the right direction. I'm putting blue right over the highlight on the beak. Now we'll come back through with the white Inktense block to get the brighter highlight on top of that. We'll do a little bit with the white pencil too, but the main height, like the shiniest parts, will be done with the white Inktense block. So it's okay if this is dark right now. Pulling quite a bit of blue in there now. We've got right along the underside of the feathers here. Let that overlap into that black. Actually, I did switch to black here. I am still pushing hard, watching how that shifts directions. And I'm pushing really hard with that white pencil. Now, if I were to blend that white pencil out, it's no longer, it's just going to make the area look foggy. It would not have the opacity that I'm getting here, or the opacity that I get. The white Inktense block mixed with water, and especially to where it's really thick, so not a ton of water, that's going to be the most opaque you can get. And I start to form some of these clumps of feathers. I can't stress this enough. Look at your reference photo. And if you start to lose your place on the reference photo, and you're like, it just looks like a mess of nothing to me. Focus on one little area at this point. So you would do like 1 or 2 square inches. I like to take a piece of paper, and I've done this for students for years. Take a piece of paper, cut out 1 or 2 square inches, and cover your artwork. So all you can even see is that 1 or 2 square inches. Do the same thing over your reference photo. That's all you're focusing on. Flip it upside down if you need to. It is another huge, huge tip. You will notice so much more if you're working upside down than you do right side up, because you start to trick your brain into seeing what's really there. That's one of the biggest parts about art and improving our work, is convincing our brain to see what's there and not what the brain thinks is there, like kind of stopping the brain from trying to override what we're actually seeing. And you want to look at a lot of this in abstract terms of abstract shapes. I'm not looking at this as I'm drawing a feather. I'm looking at it as, okay, this black line curves to the left here, and then it comes up at this area. Look at the abstract shapes. Now there, I'm taking an orange color that I used quite a bit on this. This is the cadmium orange, so that I started getting more vivid colors in this. And there I'm using a brown, pushing really hard, starting to get some of these speckles in there. Now again, you may be thinking, oh, you said this was good for beginners. Yes, it's time consuming, but it's going to look good if you take the time to put this level of detail. Now the trick is, don't put detail for the sake of detail. We're not just putting random polka dot lines or random lines all over the place. You can't do that. That's going to look terrible. To make it look good, we look at the reference photo and base it off what we're seeing there. One little area at a time. So as I worked on this, you saw that I focused more around the eye and the forehead, and then the other side of the face. Now I'm working on the left side here. So I'm focusing mainly on one area at a time, not the whole owl at the same time. So one mistake a lot of people make is they'll be like, okay, I'm using this brown color, where I want to put brown everywhere where brown goes. That gets very overwhelming, and your work is going to be very messy. Instead, break it up into a smaller chunk as you're working on these beginning stages. Again, with the black, we're going to make this nice and dark. And it's okay. You can see how some of this, I let it fade out into that lighter gray area. Don't feel like the whole thing needs to be solid. Notice that these lines really overlap with each other. It's not just random one-off lines. See how they group together? Don't know if I've mentioned to look at your reference photo in the last 30 seconds, but if not, make sure you're doing that. So there I'm taking the brown. Look how I go in between the black and the lighter tan tones. So we get that nice transition. And these are simple details. They're not super accurate. Now, let's say you wanted to bring this to a more advanced stage. I mentioned this would be more of what I would consider for a good one for beginners. One, I would work larger. So you've got a lot of room for tiny details. And the other thing is I would spend more time with a small paintbrush, like a small liner brush, just refining edges, keeping everything super clean, and really copying what I see on that reference photo. So this is a bit looser. It's close. It looks good, but it's not quite as refined as I would go if I were doing something a bit more advanced. And that's really where I start shifting that. Now, naturally, when you're first starting, the more advanced, the tiny, tiny details, noticing all of the little things, it's a bit more difficult. So this is a really good stage to start. And if your goal is to do things that are more advanced, that are more detailed, more refined, that will come with practice. That will get easier the more you paint and draw. So if you ever hit that point and you're like, I don't see the details you're even talking about, that comes from painting and drawing a lot. The more you do, the more you're going to start to notice. But it won't happen magically unless you're spending time at the easel or your drawing board. And I really have to push hard to get this white to show here. Notice that the pencil's not super sharp either, because if pushing as hard as I'm doing, that would break the tip. So when I do sharpen this, unless I'm going to be using a lighter hand, I don't want to sharpen it to a super long point. When I do sharpen it, the shorter point is better. Think golf pencil. See, I'm transitioning that black into the brown, so it's not just black, light tan. It's brown, black, then I've got the brown that I'm doing now, and that fades into a lot of that light tan. So I've got multiple shades of brown in there, or multiple values of brown, I should say. I'm going to speed this up a little because we're just repeating that same exact process we just did for the rest of this, going back and forth between brown, black, and white. And for areas that you want to blend your Inktense out, especially where I've done the pencil now, so that part can be reactivated or activated, I should say, with water, you can use just a regular brush that has water on it, or you can use a water brush. The water brushes are so much easier. I was just too lazy to get up and grab one, which is funny because I was making more work for myself in doing that. But though either way will work. I'm just going to lightly go over this and soften out some of the brown transition into the white feathers. There's just a little bit of water on that brush. Don't have too much or it'll run. If you don't have enough, it's not going to blend at all. So you've just got to test out how much water gives you the results you're looking for here. Just a little bit of blending there with water. There is no paint on that brush or ink, it's just water. So I'm going to take a little bit of blue and smudge this out. Be careful. So I have made a mistake with that blue where I've used it and put a little bit too much pressure. So I had a lot of the blue pigment on the paper, and when I blended it, it went everywhere. There was so much. So now I've learned when I add that little bit of blue and I'm trying to get just a little punch of color, just don't apply much. Just a little bit and then blend it. But be careful because, oh my gosh, I have done that so many times because you'll add the pencil, the color with the Inktense with the pencil, and it doesn't look like much color is coming on there. And then you blend it and you're like, oh my gosh, that wasn't what I meant to have happen. See, as I go over this again, this is just water. You can see how much more vivid the colors that I'm blending out show up. It didn't look like it when it was the pencil alone, but once you add water, it gets pretty bold. Not as big of a deal on the browns, but definitely more so on the blues. Now look how dark I ended up going around the eye there. I needed to go that dark so that the white would show up. Now, this is my favorite. This is a rake brush, so you can really see all the little bristles there. And I'm using white, the white block. I have thinned it with water, and I'm going to go ahead and start fraying some of the edges of these feathers and then using it as that same brush to pull out some of the brightest white highlights too. Now here's the thing when you use the white Inktense. When you put it on, it doesn't look that opaque. It dries super opaque, so be careful. It's going to be bold. But if it was too much, it's not a big deal. You can go back over it with another color. But it does dry really opaque. Now, if you don't have a rake brush, you could use like a script liner brush. That would work too. You're just going to do more brush strokes to get the little frayed edges. That's probably easier to control for most people. It just takes a little longer. Now, when you use a rake brush, I do have a video specifically showing you how to use them with acrylics. The same concept would apply here with Inktense. So check that out if you've not used them before. But my biggest tip for you is do not push hard. You have to have the right amount of water versus ink, but also the harder you push, if you push very hard, it comes out just like a normal filbert. You don't get those little wispy hairs like what I'm getting here. So you just barely want the tip of the bristles to touch the paper to get that look. Definitely practice that on a scratch piece of paper if you're new to using these, because you've got to figure out how to get the right balance. And see how I can turn it to the side and get thin lines. So I'm almost using it like a liner brush there. One of the things you want to be careful of when you're making brush strokes, they should not all be the same. Sometimes you'll make one or two brush strokes and think, wow, that looks just like a feather, it's perfect. And then I'll just make the same brush stroke again and again. No, look at that reference photo. There's so many times that that brush needs to twist and turn and shift to create a different shape. You really need to look at that photo. Spend more time looking at your reference photo than you do the artwork itself. Now, all over the place here, I am getting way too light, but I'm also creating great feathery texture, so we will just go back over it to darken it up as needed. Now, using a smaller rake brush may have been a wiser choice here. I couldn't find mine. I was surprised I even found this one. A small one would be a little bit easier to control. You don't need to work with one this large. See there, just a regular round brush would probably have been easier. Get some frayed edges here. Now this is when, if I was going to do something more advanced and more controlled, I would definitely do the areas around the eye with a liner brush. This gives you the look of feathers, but you don't have a lot of control in such a small area. I'm taking brown and doing the same thing with that rake brush, just starting to create that texture of feathers. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful of when using the rake brush is don't repeat, well, I mean, I guess that's the true of any case, but if you repeat the same brush stroke again and again, it gives you a very unnatural feel. The trick with the rake brush is to get some variation in there so that it does look more natural. Usually I'll come back through and do finer details with a liner brush or another brush to break up because it looks too uniform. One brush stroke, again and again, you start noticing a definite pattern there. So that's where you want to make sure you're twisting and turning, making some adjustments as you work with it. So we've got a more reddish brown tone we're pulling in here. Now I'm using a rake brush, but I'm pushing a little bit harder so I get more of a solid fill. Again, that lighter hand, you'll get the several brush strokes in one stroke. You push harder and it works just like your normal filbert. As you get to this stage, spend some time taking a step away from the work, look at it from a distance, take a photo on your cell phone, look at it that way, and decide where you might want areas to be darker or lighter. When you're sitting up close, everything just kind of starts blending together. I'm pulling a little bit more of that background blue into the subject. Don't go crazy with this. Starting to pull some more of that reddish brown right along the edges especially. We'll darken that up. So I'm using a much smaller filbert here. We're going to start getting some more of the white feathers, much more defined. So we have a lot of the little white speck guys. And then some of the floopier ones also making them, and you watch that, like the brushstroke I just made, watch how when it dries, it gets super opaque. So you'll make the brushstroke and it'll feel like you can't see anything. It shows up when it dries. I ended up finally finding my teeny tiny little rake brush. It also has a gray handle. So I used that, or green. I used that a little bit as well. At some point I'm going to switch over to that one. So it gives you those more frayed ends. You can definitely end up with too much because you can't see how bright that's going to dry. If you do, and I do too, I always do, go back over it with a little bit of color. Don't stress yourself out or worry too much about it one way or another. It's an easy fix. So this one is the rake brush, the teeny tiny one. Now here I do have a little bit of light blue mixed with my white. This is going to give you a very pastel look. So like I was talking about before, if you just want a lighter version of the color you had, then you would just put that color thin down on top of white. But in this case, I'm going to get a very pastel blue. Now the benefit in that case to have putting the blue, mixing it with a little bit of white, keeping that pastel blue, if I had put the blue itself would be too vibrant. I just want that hint of blue, but I also wanted that pastel look, and that's why mixing with white worked really well. Now here I'm taking my black pencil and I'm going right back in between. See how I create more of a fray where my white got a little bit too solid? I'm gonna use my black here. See how you can just keep reworking an area, going back and forth until you get it how you want it to look. This is why it's so important. Don't give up just because you have layers you don't like. Those layers you don't like are totally normal. Here I've switched to using some brown too. So I'm going back and forth depending on how dark I want that area to be. So the edges of just the brown feathers, I'm using brown. And then where I just need to define the black more, I'll switch to the black pencil. So I'm going back and forth with those, creating that little bit of detail. Okay, so this is what you should look like at this point. It's step 7. You're starting to get a lot of details. Things are getting more refined. The main thing we're going to start focusing on next are lighting and then those final details. And you can see here the main thing we're really going to focus on, or the main thing that's more obvious, I should say. Look at the blue outlining that we're going to do with the Inktense block directly to the paper. So this is one of the only times that you're going to see me use the Inktense block. You may think, well, I'll fill in the background faster by sketching over it and then adding water to blend it out. That gives you a very grainy, gritty look. Sometimes that looks great, but in this case, not what we were going for. Here, though, where I like to use the block directly on the paper are for final details, and I'm going for a looser feel. If I wanted something super realistic, I'm not going to use the block like this. But what you'll see me do is go around edges and pull out. It almost gives you a charcoal, like a chalk, like you'd use as a kid in school or on sidewalks. It gives you that sort of feel, and it comes out very opaque. So still going back through and darkening little bits up here and there. This is definitely not going to be like colored pencil where you're using your wax or oil-based pencil. With those guys, you do hit a point where you can't get more layers. When you're working with Inktense, you can just keep layering until you like it. So that's why when you have those layers where you're like, I'm not feeling this one, just go over it. No big deal. It's more like acrylic painting in that. I always felt like Inktense is sort of a really nice balance between watercolor and acrylic painting. It's somewhere in the middle of those two to me. So now with that block, I'm putting a decent amount of pressure. Now notice that the block that I'm using is broken. Your Inktense may arrive to you broken. It doesn't really matter because I know if they're in crumbly pieces, sure, yeah, definitely have that replaced. But for the most part, you're going to end up breaking them on your own if you go to apply them like I'm doing here. If I'm using a very large piece, it's just going to snap. They're very, very brittle. So I break them intentionally into smaller pieces when I'm applying like this because I do have to add a lot of pressure. If that's long and I add pressure, it's going to break. So I may as well get into a more comfortable length in the first place. Putting a few little highlights on some of the black, and I'm really going around those edges. So he's got that outer glow. Now, anywhere where I'm putting the block, very few of these places am I going to blend out. Maybe a little bit on the brown there. But for a lot of these, that blue especially would just take over. Now that's going to lighten up a lot. It's not going to stay that dark. You can see this just over the next couple of minutes, how much that lightens up. Or I'll just take the hairdryer to it and speed it along. Now, what do you do if it's too dark? Go back over it with white and then do it again. You're not limited. Now look how well that white shows up because I put that dark down first. same thing with the white block, and this will give me a nice soft look, but it's not going to be as opaque as if I mixed it with some water and painted it directly onto the paper. Oops, smudged that a little bit. I'll have to wipe that out. Now, adding the blue like I'm doing here, it's not because that's what's accurate to the photo. It's more of a stylized thing. I just like how it looks. Going back over with the black and defining those areas. And I'm not just making them darker, I'm doing that too, but I'm also getting the edges a little bit thicker. And then adding some just because either I missed it or I thought it would look better if that was added. Now I'm going to speed this up because you're not seeing it. I don't think it's helpful going slow with the tiny changes I'm doing, but when it's sped up, look at the little, I mean, the brush strokes or pencil strokes are the same as we've been doing, but look at the little changes I'm making and how it all adds up to the end. Little specks, lots of little specks in there. I'm using browns, I'm using blacks. I actually came through with a bit of violet on some of this too. I just went over the black. It made the black look darker. So there's with the violet. It doesn't look violet or purple, it just makes it a bit darker. And see all these little specks, tiny little things. And this is the cool thing. You don't have to be a super advanced artist. And this is why I think this is good for beginners, because you don't have to be advanced. This doesn't have to be perfect, but adding all of these little details, these little specks, these will make the work look so good. And it does not need to be perfect. Using a bit of brown here, darkening some of these areas. Using the white block to make these even brighter. The white, I kept trying with the white block. It wasn't even as bright using the block directly to the paper as the white pencil. Now, the lesson in that is we are always experimenting. As you're working, you should always be trying a few new things. What happens if I use the block instead of the pencil? What if I push harder with this one versus that one? You should be experimenting constantly. This is one of the main ways you're going to end up improving. So here I'm taking this brown and going directly on the paper. I'm not going to blend this out. Just getting a few more specks that when you use the block, it comes out really opaque. So pretty handy for those last details. Now on the bigger feathers, I may blend those out to soften it, but the little specks, I'm just going to leave those alone. I usually just scrape that with my fingernail off because I couldn't find an eraser handy. I'm going to use a brighter orange right around the eye. I'm not going to blend that out. I'm going to leave that so it's just really bold. See that orange? I grabbed the whole thing. That's going to snap. If I used that very long, that block would have just snapped. It would be easier just to break it into a smaller piece. But I wasn't using it on a large area, so I was being lazy, just grab the whole block. But if I was going to be using it much, I would certainly break it into a smaller chunk. Much easier to work with. I'm going to put the blue a little bit over the white of the eye. So we want it to look like the sky or background is reflecting on that shine on the eye. And then I'll use the brightest white. I'll do a dot with painting the white Inktense. That'll be my brightest highlight. And while I have that out, may as well put some more details with that liner brush. I believe that's a number 2 synthetic hog-haired liner. A tack-on bristled liner would work as well. Now, whenever you use the blocks, just remember this is going to add some texture, some visual texture. It'll be a bit rough looking there. So if you're going for something super smooth, you're not going to choose to add the blocks directly to the paper. But look how nice and opaque that is. Like it shows up really well in a way that, like the pencil. So if I grab that version of the same pencil, it's going to be really dark. Whereas if I use the block, it comes out more opaque, much lighter. It shows up really well. The formula of the block and the pencil are very different. Well, actually, I can't say that they're different. I don't know what they use to make them, but in practice, they do not work the same. So there we go. There is the finished owl. Let me know if you want me to do this same one with more refined, advanced techniques so we can talk about the difference there. I don't know if that's really of interest to anybody, so just let me know if you wanted to see this one again. Basically, the difference would be I would work larger, and then take more time on tiny details. So there you go, though. Inktense, one of my favorites, just in that it's very quick. That was a 2-night project for me. Now I work fast, so for the average person, I'd say maybe a 4-night project, but that's still a lot of detail, very quick. And again, if you watch this and you're a beginner thinking, oh, I don't know if this looks too busy, too hard, it's easier to make this look good than something that's much more simple. The simple things, it's very hard to hide mistakes. This one, it's so busy, you don't even notice half of them.